Oversight and investigations will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess of the subcommittee at any time. The subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on desecrating Old Glory, investigating how the pro-Hamas protest turned National Park Service land into a violent disgrace. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements are limited to the chairman and the ranking member. I therefore ask unanimous consent that all other members' statements be made part of the hearing record if they are submitted to in accordance with Committee Rule 3.0. Without objection, so ordered. I ask unanimous consent that the following members be allowed to sit and participate in today's hearing. The gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Stauber. The gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Carl. The gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Steele. The gentleman from Iowa, Ms. Miller-Meeks, Dr. Miller-Meeks. The gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Yakum. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Esposito. The gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Van Orden. And the gentleman from New York, Mr. Williams. Without objection, so ordered. I now recognize the full committee's chairman, Mr. Westerman, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Gosar, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. When Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu gave a joint address to Congress in July, violent protesters clashed with law enforcement less than a mile away at Union Station. The rioters chanted terrorist slogans, hurled what appeared to be human feces at U.S. Park police officers, destroyed government property, burned American flags and an effigy of Prime Minister Netanyahu, and raised a Palestinian flag in place of Old Glory on federal property. That night, I joined my fellow Republican members to return Old Glory to its rightful place. While we observed the vandalized property just a few hours after the riots finally cleared, the question on all of our minds was, how did this happen? After all, D.C. is no stranger to protests and free speech demonstrations, but in this case, something went horribly wrong. That's why we are here today, to investigate how pro-Hamas protests turned National Park Service land into a violent national disgrace. On July 23rd, the National Park Service issued a permit for the Answer Coalition to hold a public gathering. Answer's own language on the permit made it very clear that they support anti-Semitic, anti-Israeli rhetoric. The permit authorized organizers to gather at locations around the Capitol, including Columbus Plaza at Union Station. Protest organizers intentionally selected this date to coincide with Prime Minister Netanyahu's joint address to Congress. Long before the permit was approved, the Answer Coalition advertised their event on social media as an opportunity to, quote, arrest Netanyahu, end quote. Answer Coalition is not unfamiliar with public gathering permits and has had a long history with the National Park Service. These permits list numerous provisions with clear penalties, including fines and potential jail time for breaking the rules. Climbing a statue, for example, violates the permit. However, anyone who watched the news will see that the organizers of this event violated nearly every one of the permit's terms and conditions right off the bat. The Department of the Interior and the National Park Service also failed to provide critical support for the park police for this event, despite knowing well in advance that protests were expected. This was not a one-off event. Shortly after the tragic events on October 7, 2023, the Answer Coalition was one of the major organizations involved with launching the Shut It Down for Palestine movement, which has disrupted life on college campuses and targeted infrastructure in major cities across the United States over the last year. The group is expected back in D.C. on January 20th, 2025 to protest the presidential inauguration in an attempt to disrupt the events of the day. As our witnesses will testify, many of these organizations advocate for hateful and radical ideologies throughout America and have strong ties to terrorist organizations across the Middle East, including Hamas. They also have associations with the Chinese Communist Party. To be clear, I support every American's right to peacefully protest and express their beliefs, even when we disagree. But there are rules that must be followed, and you can't get a permit that says what the rules are and then blatantly disobey those rules and expect for there not to be consequences. It's no secret that our foreign adversaries seek to divide and disrupt our country, and they're doing so right now through a vast network of radical advocacy groups that target and radicalize our youth right here in the United States. Our federal lands should never be used as pawns for such an insidious purpose. I yield back, Mr. Gosar.
I thank the gentleman. I'll now turn to my opening statements. Good morning, everyone. I would like to thank our witnesses for coming before the committee today to examine the pro-Hamas protests at Union Station, turn National Park Service land into a violent disgrace. On July 24th, Prime Minister Netanyahu came before this Congress to share with us a message of hope for Israel and for the remaining hostages held by Hamas. He called for solidarity with Israel in the face of evil, a call heard by every member of that chamber. However, just down the street at Union Station, violent pro-Hamas protesters sought to disrupt Netanyahu's address through violence and destruction. The National Park Service had authorized the Answer Coalition to hold their anti-Israel protests that day, which, to no one's surprise, turned violent and led the National Park Service to revoke the permit for the event. The Answer Coalition operates under the Shut It Down for Palestine movement, which is responsible for major pro-Hamas protests following the tragic events on October 7th. This movement is part of a larger foreign effort to sow discord and distrust in our nation, spread anti-American sentiment, influence our politics, and to radicalize our youth. I must take a second to emphasize the severity of this problem. This sustained effort, backed by some of our most dangerous adversaries and a steady stream of dark foreign money, is gaining serious traction with youth on college campuses across the nation, and particularly on social media. The Chinese Communist Party has assembled a sophisticated and powerful network of influence with ties to radical advocacy organizations in the United States who attempt to influence our public discourse, disrupt major infrastructure, and espouse hateful ideologies that divide our nation. Meanwhile, Hamas and other dangerous terrorist groups benefit from their close relationships with these organizations and their ability to spread Hamas's message across the United States uninhibited. We must put an end to the foreign powers and the terrorist organizations exploiting our First Amendment for their own gain. Now, going back to the events of July 24th, the question remains, why did the National Park Service issue the permit to the Answer Coalition in the first place? This could have been prevented. The Answer Coalition has a known history with the National Park Service. They have repeatedly demonstrated that they cannot be trusted to maintain their order and peace on National Park Service lands and other events. In November of 2023, the Answer Coalition held an event at the Freedom Plaza where D.C. Metropolitan Police reported property damage and vandalism at the site. 2 weeks after, they participated in a demonstration outside the Union Station, which disrupted Metro services and led to 3 arrests for defacing public property. On June 8, 2024, the Answer Coalition protested outside the White House, where rioters vandalized Lafayette Square and assaulted a National Park Ranger. It baffles me that with a troubling history of disorder and violence, the National Park Service will still grant the Answer Coalition a public gathering permit for July 24th. But even so much is being asked to pay for these fines from the previous damages in the first place. I strongly believe in our right to engage in peaceful demonstrations. It is a bedrock of our democracy. However, the events that took place on July 24th were anything but peaceful. Our flag was torn down and burned. Rioters assaulted federal officers, and Columbus Plaza was vandalized with anti-American and pro-Hamas graffiti, with phrases such as, "I commend Hamas," and your community is next. The hateful rhetoric and violence displayed that day have no place in America, none. Today, I hope to hear from the National Park Service on how they are working to prevent violence on federal lands, how the Answer Coalition will be held responsible for the destruction that day, and their plans to support the park police to prevent further violation and destruction on federal properties. Enough's enough. I now recognize the Ranking Member, Ms. Stansberry, for her opening statement.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you to the ranking member and the ranking member for your statements this morning. I, too, share in the concern of defacing of public spaces and Chairman, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. The chairman's, pardon me, I'm sorry. I, too, share in the defacing of our public property and violence in public spaces, and I want to thank our witnesses for being here today. The U.S. Park Police support the Department of the Interior and National Park Service in maintaining our cherished parks and ensuring people can enjoy them safely. And in part because of the geographic area they cover, for example, in Washington, D.C., they have a unique charge. This is from their vision statement. We are guided by the principle of the Constitution working to ensure that everyone has the opportunity to safely exercise their First Amendment rights. To carry out this work, the park police must balance public safety on one hand and protecting federal property with safeguarding First Amendment rights. This, of course, can be challenging at times here in our nation's capital. The park police's preparation for demonstrations involves planning for crowd control, assessing risks, and coordinating responses to de-escalate potential violence. When situations intensify, the park police must rely on their training, clear protocols, and sufficient resources to address dangerous conditions without infringing on constitutional rights. I want to take a moment to emphasize that sufficient resources is key, and I believe in this particular situation. I am hopeful that today we can have a constructive conversation about how we can improve these processes, that we can increase resources for our national parks and our parks police. But I do worry that there is a bit of performative politics coming from my colleagues across the aisle. This is a rescheduled hearing that had been scheduled before the election. And as was just stated, there is concern that there may be protests upcoming in the inauguration. This is, of course, very much a real concern, and we should be performing oversight and preparing for that, much as we are preparing for both January 6th and January 20th as both an institution and our federal agencies. But these concerns should be applied consistently. As we all know, our national capital was attacked on January 6th. When our last presidential transition occurred. And similar to what we're talking about here today, there was the defacing of property and violence on the Capitol grounds. I don't think that I need to remind my colleagues about what went down on January 6th, but I would hope that we would apply a consistent metric to our concern for federal property and the safety of our national law enforcement. Many of these issues with respect to national parks come down to resources. I'll also note that in many cases, the issues that we're discussing here really come down to whether or not our federal agencies have sufficient staffing and sufficient resources to address the concerns that we're discussing. This is a budgetary matter. As we've seen time and time again, there have been proposals to implement severe funding cuts to the Park Police and Park Service, depriving officers of training, equipment, and personnel, and a consistent budget. I will be interested to see if our new administration, which plans to create a new government efficiency agency, which is led by outside billionaires and interests, will cut the park police funding even more, leaving our public with even less protection. If we truly value public safety, respect for our law enforcement, constitutional freedoms, we cannot cherry pick when and where these principles apply. And I hope that we can work on a bipartisan basis to come up with real solutions and reject cynical hearings and commit to giving the park police the tools that they need to protect our federal property, to facilitate peaceful protests, and to respond appropriately to escalating situations, while also ensuring that those individuals who have committed these acts are held accountable for the exercise of their authority. And with that, I say thank you, and I yield back.
I think, Gentlewoman, maybe accountability would be a great way to start, that you have to pay for your problems before you can actually have a say. I first now would like to introduce the witnesses for the first panel. The Honorable Mark Lee Greenblatt, Inspector General, U.S. Department of Interior, Washington, D.C. Mr. Charles Cuvillier, Associate Director, Visitor and Resource Protection, National Park Service, U.S. Department of Interior, Washington, D.C. Let me remind you that you have 5 minutes to speak. You'll have the green light during that time. At the 1 minute point, it'll turn yellow, and then you'll see the red light. That should kind of wrap it up. To begin your testimony, make sure you push the button so everybody can hear you. And with that, I recognize Mr. Greenblatt for 5 minutes.
Chairman Westerman, Chairman Gosar, Ranking Member Stansberry, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. Yesterday, our office published an inspection report exploring two critical areas facing this hearing. First, the National Park Service's First Amendment permitting process, and second, how NPS manages the events once the permits are approved. The report we issued yesterday is one in a series of reports that shed light on the challenges confronting both the Park Service and the Park Police related to First Amendment demonstrations in Washington. Today, I'll present 3 case studies from our oversight, which cover 3 relevant topics to our discussion. First, public safety. Second, damages. And third, law enforcement communication and coordination. First, we have identified important public safety issues related to prohibited items brought to demonstrations. Specifically, in one permitted rally on the Ellipse, hundreds of people began arriving hours early before the event with prohibited items, including backpacks and bags. Once the attendees realized that bags could not be brought into the Ellipse area, they began abandoning them in various locations around the National Mall, lying on the ground and hanging in trees. Secret Service officers and demonstration volunteers collected many of the bags and placed them in piles on Constitution Avenue. Park Police canine officers then swept some of the bags for explosives. But here's the problem. The officers said they were unable to sweep all of the bags because there were so many, and some of the bags were buried underneath other piles of other bags. These bags could easily have contained explosives or other dangerous items, posing a risk to the health and safety of members of the public, law enforcement personnel, and even the President of the United States, who was in attendance. We found that the NPS and Park Service did not have a process in place to handle the eventuality of abandoned bags. I'm concerned that malicious actors could take advantage of a situation like that should it happen again. Therefore, we identified this issue in our prior report and encouraged the department to assess and mitigate these safety risks. Our second case study concerns damages. The issue of damages poses a real challenge to the National Park Service. On the one hand, federal law provides that NPS may seek to recover damages from an event organizers, including First Amendment demonstrations. In fact, NPS's First Amendment permits themselves include clear language informing the permit holder that they may be liable for costs and damages during their events. Applicable NPS policy even provides that NPS should inspect the sites both before and after an event to document any damages to NPS property. That said, we believe there are gaps related to the department's handling of damages during those First Amendment events. Indeed, we found no evidence that the Park Service has ever pursued damages from permit holders. We understand that the Park Service has not established a process for recovering damages and does not have a system for tracking damages that have occurred on those First Amendment events. To evaluate the scope of the damages from those events, we had to rely on the recollection of one NPS official. Based on this one official's recollection and our discussions with another park superintendent, we identified 7 First Amendment events that resulted in damages to NPS property. NPS then provided documentation showing that the estimated damages for those 7 events totaled approximately $317,000. After one of those events, the Park Service documented approximately $213,000 in damages to the Ellipse turf. Our review found, however, that NPS had not retained the pre-event photos that documented the condition of the site prior to the event, and the Park Service did not attempt to recover damages from the permit holder. Now, when discussing this issue, I recognize that the recovery of damages poses a real challenge to NPS, and I acknowledge the complicated legal and policy implications that surround this issue. Therefore, while we think NPS can take steps to improve its handling of damages, I want to emphasize that we appreciate that there are no easy answers here. The third case study concerns law enforcement coordination and communication. This is, again, by Park Police during First Amendment events. Coordination and communication among law enforcement entities are crucial for 2 reasons. First, because they're frequently noisy and chaotic environments, and second, because these events involve other law enforcement entities. In a prior review, we found that poor communication and coordination among the numerous law enforcement agencies in a First Amendment event may have contributed to confusion and the use of tactics that appeared inconsistent with Park Police's operational plan. For example, we found that the Park Police and the Secret Service did not share a radio channel to communicate, that the Park Police primarily conveyed information to assisting law enforcement entities orally, and that several law enforcement officers could not hear the incident commander's announcements. We recommended that Park Police improve its communication procedures to better manage multi-agency operations and to promote operational consistency among various law enforcement organizations, and the Park Police agreed with our recommendations. This concludes my testimony, and I hope these case studies add value to this discussion, and I look forward to answering your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Greenblatt. I now recognize Mr. Couvillère for his 5 minutes.
Chairman Gosar, Ranking Member Stansberry, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today regarding recent protests on federal lands in Washington, D.C. Across the nation, the Department of Interior employs nearly 3,000 law enforcement officers to protect visitors, critical national infrastructure, and natural and cultural resources on federal and tribal lands. Within the National Park Service, both law enforcement rangers and the United States Park Police carry out this vital role. The U.S. Park Police, established by President George Washington in 1791, is a premier law enforcement organization dedicated to providing quality law enforcement to safeguard lives, protect national treasures and symbols of democracy, and preserve natural and cultural resources. The Park Police primarily oversees law enforcement on national park lands in Washington, D.C., New York City, and San Francisco, but also provides critical support to federal, tribal, state, and local partners around the country. With specialized training and handling events that involve civil disobedience, the U.S. Park Police works closely with these interagency partners during every large-scale demonstration in the Washington, D.C. area. This year, there have been several of those events. The department is committed to ensuring that citizens are free to safely exercise their rights of free speech and assembly in accordance with the Constitution and the law. There were no unanswered requests for additional resources or support for the demonstrations from the U.S. Park Police. However, at public protests in June and July, certain demonstrators did violate the law by committing vandalism, theft, and assault on Park Police officers. These acts, in all violence, in all forms, particularly against law enforcement officers, are abhorrent. The department has and continues to fully condemn that behavior. At the same time, we recognize free speech as a fundamental constitutional right, ensuring that all Americans can express their beliefs, question authority, and participate in public discourse without fear of government retaliation. The National Park Service is charged with facilitating First Amendment activities to ensure that Americans have the ability to exercise their First Amendment rights while providing for public safety and protection of resources. The USPP, our Park Police, is actively collaborating with several other law enforcement agencies and the United States Attorney's Office in an effort to investigate, identify, and prosecute those involved in the unlawful events at Columbus Circle. In coordination with the FBI, a public bulletin was issued seeking assistance in identifying several individuals. To date, 4 arrests have been made. Charges included an assault on a police officer, damage to government property, and second-degree theft of government property. 3 other individuals are under various stages of investigation, court review, or prosecution. The Park Service has been working to implement strategies and safeguards to minimize future incidents. For example, given the aggressive actions of individuals at these protests, we're exploring ways to modify permit conditions to provide that permittees and applicants who have previously held permits ensure their participants behave lawfully and inform participants of prohibited activity. Conversations are ongoing regarding the appropriate use and deployment of additional equipment, including anti-scale fencing and other icon hardening barriers. It's important to note that the department has recently undertaken specific actions to enhance the trust afforded to our law enforcement workforce, support the safety and health and wellness of officers, ensure that law enforcement programs continue to effectively provide for safe, equitable access to public lands. At the direction of Secretary Holland, and after a rigorous research and outreach process, the department's Law Enforcement Task Force issued 12 recommendations in a 2023 report. Among these is a commitment to enhance training opportunities for Park Police personnel and other DOI law enforcement and permit monitoring personnel in the Washington, D.C. area on issues such as civil disobedience. Often underlying these efforts is the need for greater funding. For FY24, the President's budget requested an increase of $5.365 million for Park Police capacity needs and to support additional recruit classes, and $6.106 million more to cover the increased cost of pay and benefits. In total, a 9.3% increase from fiscal year 23 enacted in appropriations. Congress kept overall funding flat for the Park Police in its fiscal year 24 appropriations. Funding uncertainty is continuing in fiscal year 25. The FY25 President's budget request proposed a combined net increase of $10.16 million for the Park Police to cover the rebaseline FY24 and 25 pay and benefit cost increases, restore lost capacity, and provide for increased funding for the upcoming presidential inauguration. H.R. 8998, the Department of Interior Environmental Related Agencies Appropriation Act of 2025, which passed the House on July 24, 2024, does not provide additional funding for any of these Park Police needs, though the department welcomes the $5 million in additional funding for inauguration, which is included in the current continuing resolution, a portion of which will fund law enforcement activities. The Park Service protects some of the most significant and meaningful icons and symbols of the United States, and we continue to fulfill this critical mission on behalf of the American public. Thank you for your interest and support of the National Park Service and the United States Park Police. Chairman Gosar, this concludes my testimony. I'd be happy to answer any questions you or other members of the subcommittee may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kugler. I'm now going to go to the question period. I'm going to recognize the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Westerman from Arkansas.
Thank you, Mr. Gosar, and thank you again to the witnesses. Mr. Greenblatt, if I understood your testimony correctly in your report that you issued yesterday, there are regulations in place, and permittees technically are responsible if they create damages, even if the Park Service isn't currently pursuing those damages.
That appears to be correct, yes, that all the predicate is there in terms of notice and in the regs, yes.
But there's also currently not any kind of process in place to track damages.
That's what we found in over the course of our inspection, yes.
So let's focus on that area for a minute. I think everybody would agree that, you know, our country uniquely allows people to gather and to protest, and really when it's a good protest, probably nothing says America quite like a good protest. But I categorize that with good protest, when people follow the rules, they don't infringe on other people's rights, and when they don't destroy public property. But I think everybody would also agree that if public property is destroyed, the taxpayer shouldn't be on the hook for repairing that public property. Are you aware of any other instances where if somebody intentionally destroyed public property on Park Service land, that the Park Service wouldn't go after them to pay for the damages?
My understanding is that in other contexts, not in First Amendment events, but say other events, business events or weddings, say if there's damage, that the Park Service does pursue those. But we didn't do an analysis of that, but that's our understanding, is that First Amendment events are treated separately.
Unintentional damage, like
Correct. That's my understanding, yes.
so. Do you think it would be good if the Park Service put in place some kind of process to track damages and to actually try to recoup these damages, and maybe if they've got a list of people who have damaged Park Service property, to at least not allow them to have permits down the road?
Well, certainly the capturing of the data related to how many First Amendment permits there are, where are they, what are the damages that flow from them. I think that we did not make a formal recommendation in here, but one of the things that emerged, one of the themes that emerged, is that I think there could be a better effort to get their arms around the scope of the issue, and then that will help decision makers both in NPS, in the Park Police, but also here on the Hill, to make those types of decisions, because they'll have better data. That's one of the key things, is that it was a lot of recollection as opposed to here's the spreadsheet of the damage over the last 15 years. And so that's something that we think always drives better decision making, is keeping track, certainly.
Thank you, Mr. Cuvillier. Did anyone at the Park Service have concerns about granting the permit to Answer Coalition given their violent history during protest? And if so, who raised those concerns and about what?
Thank you for the question, sir. Our pre-event planning, based upon the applicant of the permit application, included our interagency partners such as the Secret Service Uniform Division, the Metropolitan Police Department, Fire Department, EMS, our intelligence unit with the U.S. Park Police, and our special events unit with the Park Police. We base our issuance of the permit based upon what the applicant has put forth there. Answer Coalition had included their attorney as well as other members of the organization in that early planning period, clarifying what their permit request was. We initially partially denied it because the location they had asked for was already permitted for another event. And consistent with 36 CFR and 7.96, provided the alternative location of Columbus Circle. We rely upon intelligence to drive our decision-making. There was no actionable intelligence related to the permitted event to deny a permit or otherwise adjudicate it. We were informed by the Permit Answer Coalition they would provide adequate number of marshals to conduct themselves in good order as part of the permit. Initially, when the First Amendment demonstration got underway, there was no violence. It did begin in good order, sir. But for those reasons, in the early planning stages, there was no reason to deny them a permit.
So how does National Park Service define whether a proposed demonstration reasonably appears to present clear and present danger?
We really rely upon 36 CFR 7.96, which that regulatory scheme is based upon case law.
So is an applicant's history with public gathering permits relevant to this analysis?
We rely upon the applicant submitted at the time, and if we have actionable direct intelligence of a contemporaneous nature, then we would act upon that.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
I thank the gentleman. The next person we're going to go to, because he's got a time schedule, is the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Yakum.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for yielding time, and thank you for holding this hearing today. Like you and other members on this panel, I have several questions about the events of July 25th, when a large group of radical anti-Israel protesters at Washington, D.C.'s Union Station, just only 400 yards from the U.S. Capitol complex, vandalized government property with pro-terrorist slogans. They violently assaulted police officers, and they intimidated anyone in the vicinity who did not agree with them. They even pulled down the American flag, burnt it, and replaced it on the pole with a Palestinian flag. I was proud to be among a group of members that drove the short distance down to Union Station. That night when we surveyed the damage, and we raised the American flag back to its rightful place. Mr. Cuvalier, why did the U.S. Park Police only have 29 officers to monitor what was expected to be a 5,000-person protest?
Thank you for the question, sir. In our planning for the event, it was considered a full force commitment. We committed 174 officers of the force to participate in the event, and were assigned various duties and responsibilities with the permitted activity. A full force commitment means we ask officers to surrender their days off or time off, and I want to commend all of the force who consistently do this to provide for the number of First Amendment or other special events that occur within the National Capital Region. But in fact, we had 174 personnel committed to the event.
So you had 174 personnel actually on site?
They were assigned a number of different functions within the planning cycle for the entire length and physical footprint.
But with the
of it.
5,000 people actually on site, how many officers were on site to protect the nation's capital at Union Station?
Again, sir, we had 174 personnel assigned to the event within the parameters of the permit geographic location. It was, the permit incurred a number of streets, sidewalks, as well as Columbus Circle. In particular, we included our specialized units, such as the Civil Disturbance Unit, and other resources as part of that event.
But where things were actually going wrong on site at Union Station, how many officers were on site at Union Station where our American flag was torn down and burnt to the ground?
Sir, I'm trying my best to answer your question. There were 174 for the total event.
Look, this is a very simple question here.
Sure.
I understand there were 174 people in total for the event. How many people were on site where the American flag was torn down and burnt, and then the Palestinian flag was subsequently raised? Very simple.
Sure. I will get back with you to the best of my ability with.
But how do you not know that answer?
I am aware of the number of individuals that were assigned to the detail, that were in various functions to ensure public safety, of which were at Union Station, including, again, our specialized units, such as the Civil Disobedience Unit, the command and general staff officers of the Park Police, all attached to that event.
Inspector General, so Mr. Greenblatt, I know you've already started looking into this. It sounds like open investigation, started to maybe even publish additional report. Do you know the answer to that question? How many officers were actually on site?
We don't. We interacted with the Park Service, and they told us that the number 29 that was reported was not correct, but I don't know the specific answer.
So if we know that the number 29 is not correct, we have to know then how many people were on site to protect Union Station. Do we not?
Sir, again, I'm sharing with you, there were 174 personnel assigned to the overall First Amendment permitted event, including perimeter, interior, and the various roles and
Next
functions.
question. What fines or punishments were levied against the Answer Correlation organizers for the damage that they caused?
Currently, we have investigations underway identifying the individuals that were responsible for damages to property. As I shared earlier in my testimony, 4 individuals have been arrested and charged. If during that criminal proceedings and process, the Department of Justice can support restitution, that would be part of what would be part of the criminal proceedings.
And it sounds like in the permits that were issued, and I'm still trying to understand how a permit was issued to a group that is known to cause problems in the past. Do we anticipate, in the remaining time that I have, do we anticipate that this group or a group under the same people with a different name would ever be issued a permit to operate again on public land, given their lack of respect for the American flag?
Sir, per 36 CFR 7.96, that is the legal regulatory scheme for adjudicating permits. Within 24 hours, unless they are denied, they are deemed approved. So a future applicant, any applicant has a deemed approved permit when they make that
I
application.
don't even know what that means. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I think the gentleman from Montana, Mr. Rosendale, is now recognized for 4
Thank you
minutes.
so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much for holding this important hearing. In fiscal year 2024, the American taxpayers allocated nearly $7 billion in discretionary and operational funding for the National Park Service. If Congress expects the public to support significant investments, it's our responsibility to ensure that these cherished landmarks and parks are not misused as platforms for anti-American activities by foreign-aligned individuals. While foreign nationals are welcome to visit and appreciate our parks, they must do so with respect for our country, its lands, and its people. As a staunch supporter of the First Amendment and the right to peacefully protest, I emphasize that this right does not extend to violence or the desecration of our national symbols or our public property. Unfortunately, during the recent events, rioters violated the conditions of their legally obtained permit. This raises critical questions about the responses of both the agency that issued the permit and the local police who appeared to stand by as one of the Capitol's most iconic landmarks was desecrated, a site that serves as the first impression for many visitors who come to our city. I would like to know how many dual citizens or non-American nationals were involved in this protest turned riot and what penalties they're facing. Have they been deported yet? And if not, when? And what steps this committee can take to prevent such incidents from taking place in the future? Our significant landmarks must remain protected, clean, and free from the malicious intent of foreign actors. Thank you for the witnesses for joining us today, and I look forward to having your comments. Mr. Cuvalier, I want to stay on this line of questioning, trying to identify exactly what the process is. I like process. That way we have some kind of consistency, the consistent application of the law, and recognizing that the great risk of jeopardizing First Amendment rights. Are there clear guidelines which would give you the ability to deny a permit? What are the main points, and why weren't they used on the request from the Answer Coalition, an organization with a history of violent and destructive actions?
Thank you for your question, sir. The criteria for which a permit could be denied is expressed in 36 CFR 7.96.
Could you give us just a couple of points, 3 points that you look to and say, this is what we're basing this on?
Sure. One would be that the location is already permitted for another event or activity, as I indicated earlier. The second would be that there's a clear and present danger. That extension of that authority goes with the officer in charge during the event, which is what occurred in this case. When the clear and present danger occurred about 40 minutes into the permitted event, they then revoked the permit. So there is a revocation clause, if you will, within the permitting process.
But is there language in there that gives you the ability, by identifying a group that has demonstrated violence and destruction previously, to give you the ability to deny that permit from the onstart?
There is nothing in the regulation that indicates prior conduct would be a cause for future permitted events.
Okay. You noted that 4 individuals involved in this protest have been arrested, while 3 additional suspects remain under investigation. Why has it taken 6 months to complete the investigation for the 3 suspects?
Thank you for the question. We've worked with our partners with the FBI who issued this public bulletin that provided photographs, asking for the public contributing to help us identify. That's what led to several of these arrests. We appreciate the public's participation in providing those tips and leads. We've been working with the Department of Justice as well with regard to ongoing investigations. Although the First Amendment permit has ended, the investigation is ongoing, sir.
So regarding the 4 arrested individuals, are all 4 American citizens?
I do not have that information in front of me, sir. I'll have to take that back.
4 people, and you don't have that information available to you right now?
Sir, I just did not.
The
bring that-
first 4 arrests that were made, you don't have that? So we can't determine, my next question, which is any of the non-citizens all unlawfully present in the United States at the time of their involvement?
I do not know the citizen status of those who were arrested, sir.
By any chance, Mr. Greenblatt, would you have that information?
No, sir, we were not involved in the investigation, so unfortunately, I don't.
So
have
we
that.
don't even know right now if any of the people that were participating in this were non-citizens or not. Mr. Chair, I see my time is very nearly expired. I will yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Montana. The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Collins, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Took too much time off. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm sitting here trying to make some notes and ask a few things of my chairman. Is it Cavalier? Cavalier? Cuvalier?
It's Cuvalier, sir. Thank you.
Mr. Cavalier, does the National Parks, wait a minute, we're from the South. Does the National Park Service modify the terms and conditions of public gathering permits based on the group that is requesting the permit? Like, for instance, would a group with a history of violence or destruction of federal property be subject to additional terms and conditions to ensure the preservation and safety of federal lands?
Thank you for the question, sir. Yes, in fact, since the July events, what we are putting as a condition of permits, the need to not only provide the marshals for your event, but the names of those individuals who would be the lead, so we have a point of contact should that become necessary during the
So the
permit
marshals
event.
are part of the group, right? They're not part of your people.
They're a part of the group. They are non-law enforcement
That's
personnel.
Self-law enforcement. What tools does the National Park Service have to mitigate violence from radical groups that have no intention of conducting a peaceful permit?
We rely upon the United States Park Police Intel Unit and our collaborative network of interagency partners, including like the Metropolitan Police Department, the United States Secret Service. It is dependent a little bit on the event in terms of who has primary lead, but all those groups come together to share relevant intelligence information.
Yeah, I think if I remember right, when we got there that night to put those flags back up, it was Metro Police that was there. Y'all weren't around. Had the Answer Coalition been cited for permit violations with the National Park Service during any of their previous events?
Answer Coalition as an organization has not been cited, no, sir.
Okay. Well, I've got down that there was. Are y'all considering changing any of your permit process at all?
With each event, we undergo an after-action review to figure out if there are better ways we can operate in the operating environment. As was expressed in the flash report provided by the IG, whether we can also improve the conditions of the permit to address some of the things like, as was described, the bag drops that were made at a previous event, so that those event organizers can make it clear to their participants what's allowable in an event, and then how to reduce the likelihood of that reoccurring, as an example, sir.
All right, so the Shut It Down for Palestine event, even though they were hosted by Answer Coalition, and I think many other different groups participated, none of these groups, they're not held liable for violating the terms of the permit. So how do you intend on changing that?
We need to work with our partners in the Solicitor's Office and the Department of Justice if we're going to seek restitution in any amount. So we would seek the advice of agency counsel as well as DOJ before pursuing some restitution.
So, but you think they ought to be held liable?
If we put forth conditions of a permit and they're not met, we should do our best to ensure the conditions are met before or after the fact. Yes, sir.
I'm not following.
If a condition of the permit explicitly states, for instance, that you need to provide marshals and you don't, we need to intervene and address that issue when it happens. If a condition of a permit relates to being held accountable for damages, we would again work with our DOJ partners to see if restitution can be made.
All right, well, let me ask you, so if you can make any improvements to the public gathering permit process to make it, just make it more transparent, and to further include law enforcement expertise, what would you do? I mean, change the marshals maybe?
What we've tried to do is make it clear to the permittee their obligations and responsibility to notify their participants in advance of what they, for instance, what they can and cannot bring, that they give us notice of who their marshal leads are so that they can be contacted in the event there is a need for them to maintain good order. It is on the permittee. It is the primary responsibility is on the permittee to be responsible for their participants.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I'll tell you what I think I've learned here in this short circle of answers is the fact that, that we rely on some self-governance out there. Man doesn't even know how many people were on site from the National Park Police during this thing. We don't pursue any violators. There's no process to recoup damages. But in typical bureaucrat fashion, the answer to all the questions is more money so that we can hire more people to watch what's going on. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I think the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Stauber, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Couvelier. I want to ask you a question. In the IRA funds, there were $500 million to the National Park Service for staffing. They decided to spend $19 million on police. What did they do with the other $481 million? What did they prioritize that money for?
Yeah, thank you for your question, sir. Of the IRA funding that you're describing, $29 million was allocated to the Park Police, which supports the
29 or 19 million?
29 million, sir.
Okay. I had 19 million.
That's okay. 29 million, that's about 47 officers that were put through basic training, and we'll fund them through 2030.
Okay, thank you. I just want to make note, Mr. Chair, that the National Park System Superintendent wished to testify today, but his participation was blocked by the Department of the Interior and the White House. As I look at this situation, I've got some notes here, but my colleagues have kind of changed my direction of questioning. Mr. Couvelier, if you could do it over, what would you do different or better so the safety of the people would be paramount and there was no destruction of U.S. government property? What would you have done better?
Thank you for the question, sir. You know, we get about 400 permits a year for First Amendment activity, another 2,400 for special park uses.
I just want, I get that. I just want to know about this, this tragedy at Columbus Circle.
In our planning process, we will seek to rely upon the best available contemporaneous intelligence information, which will drive our planning cycle. We will, as we have and continue to.
Did your intelligence work in this particular protest?
The intelligence we had did not indicate that there was going to be a violent permitted event.
Okay. When it started to get out of hand, were reinforcements called immediately, and where did they come from?
Thank you for the question, sir. The Park Police supervisor on duty has the ability to revoke a permit when the clear and present danger standard is met. They did that day. That was about 30 to 40 minutes into the permitted event. There was a decision. There are requirements.
When you revoke the permit, does it automatically assume more personnel are going to be there to stop it?
Thank you, sir. Yes, a couple things have to happen. The Park Police needs to allow for an opportunity for those who want to leave the event to peaceably egress, right? We don't want to create further chaos on top of what is already unacceptable behavior.
Did you get additional resources once you revoked the permit? My question is, did you get immediate resources other than the 29 that showed up?
The officer on scene utilized the civil disturbance unit to come in.
Did they show up?
Yes, sir, they did.
And in a timely fashion?
Yes, sir, they were a part of the incident.
Again, what else would you have done different?
So again, as part of the planning cycle, what we're going to do is require the permit applicant to be informed as what they need to tell their participants to discourage the bringing of whatever's prohibited per that event. So as was described in Mr. Greenblatt's testimony, when it's a Secret Service event, there's a different threshold for what you can bring than, say, for instance, a venue that's open to the public. Making sure that
Would you say it was a disgrace what happened that day to the government property and the American flag being taken down and burned?
So as a member of the National Park Service, who are charged under the Congress's direction is to protect natural and cultural resources, we don't like to see the destruction of any government property.
Was it a disgrace that our flag was burned and decimated?
I think it's important to know that the burning of the flag was not permitted in the event. It was, as we have described before, an abhorrent act in which we are trying to seek the individuals responsible for those actions.
I'm very sorry that you can't answer that question. Very simple question. Was it a disgrace that the American flag was burned and stomped on? You can't answer that question. I find it very difficult.
Sir,
I love our flag.
I agree with you, sir. I'm a 26-year law enforcement, and
I'm 23 years, for you not to be able to answer that, sir, it's very disheartening for me. I don't know what you're trying to protect. Who are you trying to protect? That's an easy answer. Mr. Chair, I'm disgusted. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Minnesota for being disgusted. The gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Carl, is up next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Coverlair, your name's been butchered so far, so I can't do any worse, right? Okay. As ranking member Strawberry pointed out, January 6th and the events on January 6th, I was in the middle of January 6th. I know a little bit about January 6th. And I was also on the floor when we were reviewing video, and we decided to go raise the flags. And I raced back to my office and grabbed 3 flags, and away we went. And I'll tell you, it was a sight when we got there. It stunk. I don't know what they were throwing, but my guess is y'all are right. It had burnt stuff and sprayed all over the statue out there. But it was a great feeling when we got those 3 flags hoisted. And of course, this old man's standing at the bottom of one of those flags, and I look, and there's all these Special Forces guys were standing around with their back to the flag, ready to defend it. That's America. That's America as we know it. And I'm sorry you can't say that. I understand it's a political position you're in. You have to be careful. But with that said, it was a proud moment for me as a congressman. I understand the chief of the U.S. Park Police, Chief Taylor, was interested in providing testimony at this hearing, but an agency decision was made for her not to testify today. Were you involved, sir, in the law enforcement decision or operation related to this protest? Did I make that clear? Were you involved in the law enforcement decision or operations related to this protest?
I was not present on scene the day of the protest. I rely upon those frontline officers, supervisors who have command responsibility for the other officers in the field to make the decisions, sir.
So do you think that the perspectives of the chief of Park Police is critical in this conversation today?
The chief of the U.S. Park Police commands the workforce and delegates her authority to her line officers.
Yes, sir, but it's important to hear that conversation today, correct?
Yes, sir. I'm here representing the Department of Interior on her behalf.
Okay. So you coordinated with the chief in preparation for this hearing, and if so, what is Chief Taylor's message to this committee? What is her message to us?
I think we have expressed to the committee our efforts to improve the permitting process. We've expressed to the committee our interagency efforts would make this possible. We've expressed to the committee the staffing commitments we have made for all permitted events, depending on scale, and how that represents sometimes a full force commitment, and we use the available resources we have. And I think those would be key messages for you,
Does
sir.
the Park Police keep track of groups, these previous threats to officers and violence?
We consider each permit on its own individual application. We don't retain records. We're based upon each applicant as it is submitted.
You don't keep records on any of these individuals that cause problems?
Our intelligence gathering must be contemporaneous with the event. That is that clear and present danger that was set forth in 36 CFR 7.96. And so we have to have actionable intelligence commensurate with the permitted event. and that drives our decision-making.
So by a fluke, I bumped into the administrator of the Capitol Police, and I was kidding him about protesters on the way here and asked him about them. He said he knew most of them by their names. So I would suggest that these same people that are being paid and/or keep reoccurring, we identify who they are. January 6th, we went through everybody that came through the building, whether they were just tourists looking like 99% of them, or the 1% that were actually meant harm to this building or to our property. And they should be held liable just like these people should be held liable. And we should know who they are. We have face recognition, we have technology, we have everything to know who these people are, and we need a database. We need to start watching who they are, because that is going to be our future if we're not careful. We just keep letting it pass. Does the Park Police provide any type of report or update to the National Park Services on groups or gatherings that turn violent?
We do not have a regular recurring report. We do an intelligence brief on a regular recurring cycle based upon whatever is happening in our Park Service lands.
And who's the intelligent briefing? Is that just within the Park Service?
That's a product produced by the intelligence unit of the United States Park Police for force use.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Mr. Chairman, I return my time.
Thank you, gentleman from Alabama. The gentlewoman from Iowa, Ms. Miller Meeks, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for allowing me to waive one to this important hearing today. Important to me personally because I'm a 24-year military veteran, and on that day when I was crossing town and passed the flagpoles with a non-U.S. flag up there, I asked my staff if they had a flag so I could replace the flag. Didn't even know if I could do it, but apparently if violent protest groups can replace a flag, then I could certainly do it as a member of Congress. In the testimony we've heard today, we've learned that, unsurprisingly, the Answer Coalition is affiliated with multiple organizations that are part of a well-funded network with ties to hostile foreign governments and jihadist extremist groups. The Shut It Down for Palestine Coalition, whose membership includes the Answer Coalition, has orchestrated frequent protest activity, including blocking roadways, tunnels, and bridges across the country. Mr. Greenblatt, I recognize the difficult line that you walk of protecting American citizens' constitutional rights while upholding law and order. As a veteran, I may not like the Supreme Court's ruling that burning and stomping on our flag is freedom of speech, but nonetheless, I uphold their ruling. However, when people commit crimes in this country, they're liable to losing certain rights and privileges depending on the nature of the crime. Does a history of illegal activity factor at all into the United States Park Police's decision to issue a demonstration permit? And we may already have that answer from Mr. Cuvelier.
Yeah, I believe that's a question for the Park Service in terms of their regs and policies.
So I understand, Mr. Cuvelier, that you don't keep records of groups and of activities. So if you don't keep any records, then from who is actionable intelligence obtained from?
If an individual were convicted of a crime, there would be a record of that conviction. As far as organizational records, we do not maintain records on organizations. We base our permitting process, again, on what's codified in 7.96 of CFR and the applications permit and the pre-planning that goes into that application process.
My apologies. I ask you, from who is actual intelligence obtained from? You have violent groups, history of violence, history of destruction of property, history of support from terrorist organizations, known terrorist organizations, but yet you don't keep records, but you receive intelligence. So who provides that intelligence for you so that you can make a rational decision on who to give a permit to, especially if they've engaged in criminal activity in the past when trying to, exert their First Amendment rights?
Thank you for the question, ma'am. We engage in an interagency planning effort. We draw on intelligence from all our interagency partners, be they the Capitol Police, the Metropolitan Police Department, Secret Service, and so that we all have visibility on all our different activities occurring in our jurisdictions. And that is one of the primary means in which we gather our intelligence.
So then let me ask this question. If you don't keep records, and if those records that from previous events are not kept in order to make a decision on granting a current permit, then is it necessary for Congress to issue to you the authority and guidance to, number one, keep records, and number two, to deny permits to individuals who have a history of destruction of federal property, of violent activity, of non-peaceful protest? Do we need congressional remediation to address this gap in your ability to grant permits?
If this committee or subcommittee were to take congressional action, we'd seek our assistance for technical assistance, we would provide that. The 36 CFR 7.96 is largely structured based upon case law, and if there is other needs to review that or address that through congressional action, we would do so.
And perhaps if the chief of the Park Police were here today, we might have a real answer to that question. Thank you so much for allowing me to wave on. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
I thank the gentleman from Iowa. The gentleman, rock, paper, scissors, is from Wisconsin, is now recognized for his 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for waving on this committee. Mr. Kubalier, my first question for you is, do you have a pencil or a pen? Okay, write this down, please. It is https://www.state.gov/foreign-terrorist-organization/. So you're telling me that you can't deny permits. Could you deny a permit for ISIS? Could you deny a permit from Al-Shabaab, from Al-Qaeda, from the Haqqani network, from Hezbollah? Yeah? Jamal al-Islamiyah? Anybody?
To my knowledge, we've never had an application for a permit from those
But
organizations.
you just told me you couldn't deny it even if you had one. Okay, so that's a list. It's really super duper long. Yeah, keeps going. Those are the list of the designated terrorist organizations by the State Department, sir. And you got a bunch of people, you're saying that you can't deny a permit. So you're telling me, a member of Congress who has fought for this country my entire adult life, multiple combat tours, all that stuff, about 50 of my friends killed in training combat since 9/11, tragically, that you would not deny a permit, or you're incapable of denying a permit for the groups that are responsible for killing tens of thousands of American citizens and hundreds of thousands of our allies around the world. Is that right?
No, sir, that's not what I'm saying. I'm careful about engaging in hypotheticals that haven't happened.
Check me out, dude. A bunch of terrorist supporters didn't hypothetically tear down the American flag and fly a Palestinian flag on your property. So don't come here with that little trite thing about hypotheticals, pal. That happened. And me and some of my buddies went down there and flew those American flags again, and you did it. That's pathetic. Are you familiar with the concept of predictive analytics? You're probably not. It is a branch of advanced analytics that makes predictions about future outcomes using historical data combined with statistical modeling, data mining techniques, and machine learning. Okay, so I'm going to give this to you so that the next time someone applies for a permit on your property, you could use this concept to understand that you're probably going to have people that are destroying government property. This is just absurd. So we stand for something, you allegedly stand for something, because your conduct and the conduct of your department is displaying something that you say is inappropriate, right? Is it appropriate to destroy government property or not? Is it an unlawful activity? Is it a First Amendment right to destroy government property? Yes or no?
As I stated before, we are working in our investigations to hold individuals accountable for the criminal acts in which occurred.
Okay. You can tell that I'm not a member of this committee because I was speaking into the wrong microphone.
I can hear you. Yes,
Yeah,
sir.
I know you can hear me, pal. I don't need a microphone. And I didn't need one that night when we went down and said the Pledge of Allegiance after we reflew those American flags. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to read that website. I want you to write down those lists of terrorist organizations that are acknowledged by our government. I want you to exercise predictive analytics in the future, because what you're doing is a disservice to the United States of America, and it disgraces that uniform you're wearing. And I wore one for 26 years myself. Is that clear, sir?
I understand what you're sharing, sir. Thank you.
I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Wisconsin. The gentleman from Minnesota is acknowledged.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I just want to, in my testimony, I questioned Mr. Kubalier about the IRA money. and there was a discrepancy. I said 19 million, you said 29. I want to enter into the record the government executive report that says it was actually $19 million that the Park Service got to hire police officers, Park Service officers in New York City, San Francisco, and Washington, D.C. And I yield back.
Without objection, so ordered. The gentlewoman from New Mexico, Ms. Stansberry, is recognized for her 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to get this right from the very beginning. Mr. Associate Director, can you please help us with the pronunciation of your name?
Sir, if you remember the car, the Cavalier, I'm a Cuvalier. If that helps you.
Cuvalier. All right, we got it. Okay, Mr. Cuvalier. First and foremost, let me just say thank you for your service to this country. Thank you as a member of law enforcement. Thank you to the 3,000 Parks Police who are law enforcement and dutifully show up every single day in their uniforms and serve this country. These are dangerous jobs, these are important jobs, and we do thank you for your service. And I do want to apologize, as you have appeared in front of this committee, for comments that have appeared to be disrespectful to you or to any of the law enforcement that serve our great nation. I know that my colleagues, especially those across the aisle who have also served as law enforcement, whether it was national or local and in the military, know how important your service is. But sometimes the political arena in which we operate can lead people to be disrespectful in their tone and their words. So I apologize for that. Now, I want to take a moment to talk a little bit more about the process of how National Parks approaches these applications, what happened on the actual day, and get clarification about the incident and its aftermath and how the Park Service, alongside the lawyers for the federal government, is pursuing justice. So, as the National Park Service received the application for this particular protest, was there anything, to your knowledge, that raised concerns about how the protest would proceed and that there might be some act of violence or desecration?
Based upon the applicant permit application that was filed, no, there was not. As part of the pre-planning, we engage with all our interagency partners to understand what they know, what they have as contemporary as intelligence information. We also engage the permit, in this case, Answer Coalition, seeking clarification on what their intentions are, where, and as where occurred in this case, the first choice of location was already taken, providing an alternative location. So we do that as part of the planning cycle. I think the IG pointed out very clearly our planning cycle is largely driven or compressed by when the application's received. Sometimes we have plenty of notice, sometimes we have just simply days.
And, you know, there have been a number of protests, not just this last year, but over the last several years on our national parks property. This is one of the challenges, of course, of being in our nation's capital and being a free nation where we allow free speech. And I really appreciate the IG's report, which was released this week, which enumerates the various protests that happened on parks land this summer. And I want to note something very important on page 9 of the IG report, which is that there are at least 5 incidents that are noted here that cause significant damage to national parks or federal property. And the incident that's being discussed here today, the IG found that the damage to the property was on the order of about $11,000 to federal property. That is inexcusable, of course, and it sounds like we're going to get to the bottom of how that is being prosecuted. But I want to point out here that the IG found that January 6th, the attack on this Capitol caused more than $250,000 in damages just to parks property. And that doesn't even account for the damages that happened overall to this building. In fact, there was $2.7 billion in estimated damages and 7 deaths, according to Congress's own investigatory body, the GAO. So certainly, we are a nation that protects free speech, but if we are going to talk about and apply policy and make sure that our agencies and our federal law enforcement are able to respond to these incidents, we need to be honest about the conversation here and what we're trying to do. So in this particular incident, tell us what justice is being pursued and how those who have been found to be culpable will ultimately, what that process will look like.
Yes, thank you for your question. We used, again, our partners with the FBI to create a bulletin. The FBI has assisted us in identifying open source video and other kinds of imagery. The public's tips and leads have all led to the arrest of at least 4 individuals, as I shared earlier, the investigation regarding 3 others. They've been charged for damage to government property, assault on officers. Through that criminal process, that will adjudicate either their innocence or guilt. And as we work with DOJ, if there's an opportunity for restitution, we'll engage in that conversation as well.
Thank you very much. So there is a justice process, and so the comments this morning that have been made that there's no justice being pursued are just factually untrue. And I think that IG report is very illuminating. These are challenges that actually, as members on this panel, we do need to address and make sure that there's consistent policy and consistent resourcing for our federal agencies. And I thank you for coming today and for your service.
I thank the gentlewoman from New Mexico. The gentleman from New York is now recognized for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank Chairman Gosar for allowing me to be present here today, and Chairman Westerman, thank you for allowing me to be read in. I want to add a different angle on the events of July 24th and have them entered into the record because I think they're material. You know, as the Prime Minister of Israel spoke, and we were on the House floor, is of course when these events, these tragic events, in a stain in our capital were taking place. And as we participated in the event of hosting Prime Minister of Israel, we were unaware, members of Congress, of what was unfolding on the just a few blocks away. But when I returned to my congressional office and turned on the TV, I saw the shocking images of your officers being assaulted. I saw the shocking images of our flags, the 3 American flags, being hauled down and burned. Much has been said about First Amendment rights. And it's true, you have a right to burn the American flag if it's your own flag. You don't have the right to tear down government property and burn it. That is vandalism, and that was a riot. Like many other Americans, I was appalled by what I saw on the television that day. And immediately, my mind went to work because this is just blocks away from the heart of our democracy. What is it that we can do to make this right? I drove home that afternoon after the Prime Minister's speech to have a short dinner with my wife in our little apartment. And as I left there, I told her, honey, I'm going to make this right, that we are going to restore those flags. It's a short distance from our apartment. We had a late night series of votes that evening, and I purposefully drove by Union Station to see if the Palestinian flags had been removed, to see if the American flags had been restored, and the American flags had not. I'm a nuclear submarine officer, a nuclear submarine veteran, and so we tend to be very meticulous. So I looked up pictures to make sure that the flags flew 24/7, and in fact they did. There's a lot of, they are illuminated, and they are meant to be there in all 3 flagpoles flying. But the flagpoles were bare that night, right about 8:30 at night. We were called back for a late night series of votes. I had about 45 minutes on the floor of the House of Representatives to recruit fellow members of Congress to come with me to restore those flags. I'm very honored to be joined by Congressman Mike Collins, who was one of the 8 who joined me that evening. I'm not going to lie to you. I was looking for veterans and rednecks. I'm not going to tell you which one Representative Collins represents. But I will say that I assembled about 8 other members of Congress to come with me. 4 of them were Navy SEALs. I can pretty confidently say this is the only time that a submariner has led Navy SEALs into combat, something I love mentioning to them at every opportunity. And just as I was walking off the House floor, I ran into Speaker Johnson, and I said, Mr. Speaker, here is a picture of the flags, the flagpoles that are bare, right at the heart of our democracy. Would you join us in making this right? I called one of my staff members, asked him to find 3 flags. Congressman Morgan Luttrell had done the same. And so we arrived there with 6 flags, 8 members of Congress, and we actually ran in, sir, to your colleagues and to the Metropolitan Police. We didn't know how we would be greeted. And I want to tell you, your staff and your officers were so welcoming and so excited that the leaders of the country had come to make this right. We raised those 3 flags, the 3 American flags that night. There were no, there wasn't in front of 20 camera crews. There were no other staff members other than one of my staff, just the 8 of us that had walked over to make this happen. And with the assistance of Metropolitan Police and the Park Police. So thank you. After that, Congressman Van Orden, who I understand was just here, another member of this party, said, Brandon, you led us here. Why don't you lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance? And we lined up and we recited the Pledge of Allegiance. Even as a Navy veteran, it's never meant more to me than it meant on that night of July 24th. What's important, I think, about this event is that standing up to all forms of riot, not just because of whatever political persuasion they are, but standing up to all of it is significant and meaningful. And there are many who failed to do to speak out against this riot. But there were 8 of us that went and made it right. And I'll tell you why that's important, and I will close with this comment. In every community in America, we are looking for leaders to stand up and make things right, including the gentleman, the Marine on the New York City subway, Mr. Penny, who's just been acquitted of crime for which he never should have been tried, because he stood up to make things right. And as you see other people in your community making things right, it gives others courage. And if you see the leaders of this nation stand up and make things right, it will give others courage to do the same. And so thank you, Mr. Chairman, for giving me the opportunity to enter the aftermath of this into the record. And I'm proud to be joined by other members of this committee that stood with me that day. And I yield back, sir. Thank
Without
you.
objection, so ordered. I'll go to me. I'll be the last one. So I'm always about trying to reform something. So one of the things I want to ask you, Mr. Greenblatt, is would it be helpful if you had any non-government or agency that actually takes any penny from the federal government, that they would have to disclose where all their money comes from? Would that help?
If they would have to put up, I didn't.
Well, yeah, I just want to know if they took federal money, 1 penny of it, whether either direct or indirectly through a pass-through, they'd actually have to acknowledge where they got all their money from. Would that help for transparency?
That could.
Okay.
I haven't done the analysis on that, but theoretically that could.
Okay, so now in Article 1, Section 9, that basically says that Congress has the duty to oversee federal judges. Would it be, in your opinion, good to look at, and federal prosecutors, would it be great to actually be able to call them in and say, what did you do for the First Amendment? What did you do for the Second Amendment? Third Amendment? There's got to be some accountability. There's checks and balances based throughout our whole republic. Would that help?
Theoretically, sure, yeah.
Now, let me ask you another question. So, do you know of a marriage venue that doesn't charge for a deposit on a venue?
No, I'd love to know which ones don't, but yes,
Yeah, I'd like to
I
find
think
that.
they all do.
Well, so wouldn't it be interesting that if you had this bond, and I know the gentleman has already talked about like a bond or a levy, that you actually had to put personal names down, and maybe you have to. But isn't there a way to hold those individuals accountable based upon that bond? Because, yes, you're forced to prove that you didn't leave it in disarray. It gives personal accountability to whose name is on those lists, regardless of who it is, right?
Sure. I think the issue here is the barrier to entry, the barrier to obtaining a permit, given the First Amendment protections, which are so strong, particularly in these spaces, that it makes having that bond or insurance a difficult proposition. Now, is there a possibility of threading that needle between the massive First Amendment protections out there and the NPS's requirements to protect our national and cultural heritage? Those are That's a possibility. I think Ms. Couvelier referred to engaging with DOJ and engaging with the solicitor's office in the department to see whether there's a way to thread that needle. But that is a difficult prospect. I think it works, in theory. That's what you would do in a marriage venue, say, and they do that, by the way, in weddings, on national park property. But with the First Amendment, it is, I think the thumb is on the scale to approve permits with no barriers, as opposed to something like a bond or insurance. That's the difficulty I think that the Park Service is facing.
So transparency would also lead us to believe that if you had a problem child, let's say that you put them in timeout, even though the prospects of the First Amendment is so powerful, if you don't pay up, you're violating your tenets of any agreement. So any person that has a bond, like say a jail aspect, they can say First Amendment and then get by and change your venue. But I think there's a way to do this in a way that says, listen, you violated this, your name's on the thing, you lose this bond. And until you pay that, and I think you ought to require it beforehand instead of aftermath, that you can make those changes accordingly and say, listen, I'd love to give you First Amendment, but you haven't paid this up.
So I think the other issue that they're facing is the bifurcation between holding the permit holder responsible and the individuals who caused the damage responsible. And I think that's the question, is whether there's the ability to tie the damage to the entity as opposed to the individuals. And I think that's the difficulty that the Park Service is facing, is do you hold the permit holder responsible, even say if it's not their personnel, if you will, or not at their
I got
instruction.
You. But Mr. Van Orten also talked to you about you have a list of these bad actors.
Sure.
And it'd be a simple test. Are you a part of these bad actors? Do you have an XP on your name? You filed this for this bond, and you didn't do anything, and you got a problem there. I think there's a way to thread that, don't you think?
I'm happy to engage in the discussion and help, but I don't know. I'm going to be very frank with you. I don't know. That's something for the solicitor, for the Department of Justice, and for the National Park Service to figure out in concert with the decision makers here on the Hill. It is a hard line to walk. This is what I said in my opening statement. I don't know that there's an easy answer there because of those First Amendment protections. I'm not saying no, and I'm happy to engage in the dialogue. I just think it's very difficult given the sheer strength of those First Amendment. It'd have to survive strict scrutiny in court, and that's the key question.
Okay, that's why I alluded to the federal judges and prosecutors for evaluation. Okay, well, I think that solves our first panel. We're going to take a short break, and our second panel will be seated. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Thank you, appreciate it.
Thank you all, appreciate it.
Mr. Alex Goldberg, Director of Intelligence Network, Tagion Research Institute, Mount Pleasant, South Carolina, and Mr. Scott Walter, President, Capital Research Center, Washington, D.C. Let me remind you how our system works. Most of you understand there's a 5-minute limit. When you're testifying for the first 4 minutes, it's green. Then we'll go to the yellow. That tells you to kind of start wrapping it up. And if you see the red, really make it short and cut off because we want to get to all the questions and let everybody. Make sure that your microphone's on and you're got the right one on for you. And it's pretty easy for you down there. Up here, it's a little bit of a mess. So I'll ask you to keep on going. So I'll introduce Mr. Spencer for your first 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Gosar, Ranking Member Stansberry, and members of the Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations. My name is Kenneth Spencer. My testimony this morning is delivered in my capacity as a chairman of the United States Park Police Fraternal Order of Police. Our organization represents the interests of approximately 350 sworn law enforcement officers of the United States Park Police. I am honored to be here today and very thankful for this opportunity to share officer views on and lessons learned from the dangerous and destructive protests in and around Columbus Circle on July 24th, 2024. On average, U.S. Park Police officers protect 160,000 daily visitors to our parks, patrols a geographic area of 30,000 acres over 3 urban metropolitan regions and more than 75 miles of highway. Notably, we are, or at least once were, the world's leading law enforcement agency when it comes to supporting large-scale special events and other First Amendment activities. Importantly, our agency's mission includes icon protection. Our officers proudly protect the Statue of Liberty, the Presidio in San Francisco, the Washington Monument, the Lincoln Memorial, the Jefferson Memorial, and many others, including the Christopher Columbus Memorial Fountain in Columbus Circle. We also patrol many federal highways, including the busy commuter routes leading into and out of Washington, D.C. from Maryland and Virginia. As members of this subcommittee are aware, the Answer Coalition protests intentionally overlapped the visit of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. On July 24th, the United States Secret Service requested the U.S. Park Police to provide tactical and civil disturbance assets in Glover Archibald Park while Prime Minister Netanyahu attended Senator Lieberman's memorial service at an adjacent location. Moreover, the U.S. Park Police provided site security in and around the Watergate Hotel and provided motorcade escort security for multiple dignitary movements throughout the visit. We were also responsible for providing multiple road and traffic closures throughout the Washington metropolitan area. At the same time, our officers were charged with assigned events at Wolf Trap for a concert, 4 construction details, and a security detail at the Frederick Douglass home. And of course, we are expected to perform our ordinary daily patrol responsibilities, which include law enforcement and community safety throughout the District of Columbia, as well as highway patrols of the Baltimore-Washington Parkway, the George Washington Memorial Parkway, and many others. We had 166 sworn officers available for the special detail on July 24th, including everyone assigned to work on their day off. Some have questioned why only 29 officers were assigned to Columbus Circle that day. In reality, it's amazing that even those resources were available to us, given the aforementioned demands of that day. One of the main reasons I am excited to testify this morning is to share to you about how proud our union is of the officers who did everything they could to protect and serve in the face of an extremely dangerous and overwhelming situation. This was not a peaceful protest. Indeed, significant subset of protesters were determined to commit brazen acts of violence and costly destruction of property. To say it plainly, our officers did a remarkable and exemplary job that afternoon with the limited resources supplied to us by DOI, NPS, and Congress. Unfortunately, our government's irresponsible neglect of the agency has led to staffing shortages that were unthinkable just a decade ago. In the last 12 months alone, our agency has lost 37 sworn officers, many whom left for other agencies that don't face the budget cuts that the DOI and NPS regularly impose upon our officers. It's disheartening that the government has allowed our once revered department to decay to the point where we are more than 150 officers short of the minimum required to accomplish our mission. Even the DOI's own Inspector General concluded earlier this month that, quote, the USPP pay scale is set up by statute and is among the least advantageous of the federal uniformed police agencies, end quote. It is no overstatement to suggest that the safety of Americans in Washington, New York, and San Francisco, as well as the millions of visitors to our urban national landmarks, are at serious risk because of our agency's staffing shortage. Importantly, Congress can and must do something about it. A bipartisan group of representatives, led by Representative Nicole Maliotakis, introduced H.R. 9928, the U.S. Park Police Modernization Act, legislation that balances the recruitment and retention resources among other federal law enforcement organizations. In particular, our officers want to thank Chairman Westerman, Representative Maliotakis, Representative Gottheimer, and Senator Barrasso for their extraordinary leadership on this issue. Notably, the Modernization Act is strongly supported by the National Fraternal Order of Police and the U.S. Capitol Police Labor Committee. The incoming administration has indicated a desire to improve the quality of life for law enforcement officers. We hope that's true, and if so, they can get off on the right foot by directing the Department of Interior and the National Park Service to incorporate the modest resources needed for H.R. 9928 in their budget request for fiscal year 2026. If Congress and the new administration fail to act, I honestly don't know if our agency can survive as a viable urban law enforcement organization with any reasonable expectation to protect safety and security during First Amendment events like the one that occurred on July 24th. To ignore this reality would be tragic and shameful. Thank you again for this opportunity to testify on behalf of the members of the U.S. Park Police Fraternal Order of Police, and I welcome any questions you may have. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Spencer. I now recognize Mr. Goldenberg for his 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Gosar, Ranking Member Strasberry, and the distinguished members of the committee. Here in the United States, the land of free speech, a well-funded network with ties to extremist groups, is exploiting the freedoms that protect legitimate protest in order to advance dangerous ideologies. Their activities may well defy the legal guardrails Congress has established to assure transparency in our public square, to limit the political advocacy of certain nonprofits, and to prohibit the provision of material support for foreign terrorist organizations. I'm not an attorney. I am, however, an experienced open source intelligence analyst. The organization of which I am a part of, the Network Contagion Research Institute, studies cybersocial threats, and we have produced research on extremism from across the political spectrum, state-backed influence operations, child safety issues online, and more. I am here today to share what our research has disclosed about the violent July demonstration at Union Station, which resulted in vandalism and at least one assault and other attempts to paralyze public bridges, train stations, airports, and other critical infrastructure. Although these demonstrations were meant to appear as spontaneous expressions of outrage, they were anything but. They were the product of a well-funded network operating on the outer edge of the law, if not beyond them. A network of organizations, many of which operate with nonprofit tax-exempt status or are fiscally sponsored by groups with tax-exempt status, work to drown out calls for genuine peace and resolution, including the two-state solution that so many in the international community advocate for. They openly celebrate and support designated terrorist organizations, advocate for the engagement of illegal activities, including the promotion of civil disobedience and organizing protests that intentionally break the law. If 501c3s are found to be encouraging unlawful action, it could lose its tax-exempt status. On October 7th, Hamas launched a surprise attack on Israel that involved coordinated rocket strikes, rapes, mass shootings, including the slaughter of families in their beds. On that same day, Breakthrough News, an outlet with close ties to the Answer Coalition, a key organizer for the demonstration we are discussing today, celebrated the atrocities perpetrated that day, framed them as resistance, and included an interview with a member of the PFLP, a designated terrorist organization that is reported to have been complicit in holding hostages in Gaza. In July, a protest at Union Station that we're organized here to speak about was organized by the Shut It Down for Palestine movement, with Brian Becker of the Answer Coalition listed as person in charge. Who is Brian Becker, the person in charge of this demonstration? He is the central organizer for the Party of Socialism and Liberation, an instructor at the People's Forum, and the national coordinator for the Answer Coalition. It's important to note that the People's Forum shares an office with Breakthrough News, which is run by his relative. The Answer Coalition has repeatedly given voice to extremist groups, including the PFLP. Just months after the October 7th attack, Brian Becker, the individual listed on the permit of the July 24th protest, hosted a member of the PFLP on his YouTube channel, reinforcing their pattern of support for violent agendas. Videos on their online platform feature other members of designated terrorist organizations. Many of these videos are even listed as fundraisers for Breakthrough News. What we are seeing is not grassroots activism. The People's Forum, one of the main organizers that participated in the July demonstrations, has received over $20 million from Neville Roy Singham, a US-born millionaire currently living in Shanghai who, according to a New York Times investigation, has been central to a global network promoting and amplifying CCP talking points worldwide. Before October 7th, this global network focused on amplifying anti-American and pro-CCP content, including denying CCP repression of Uyghur Muslims. After October 7th, this network shifted to amplify radical anti-Israel narratives and help promote demonstrations like the ones that we've seen on October 7th, one on Union Station. On October 7th, the People's Forum called on followers to join the All Out for Palestine rally in front of the Israeli consulate in New York City the next day. At that October 8th rally, as Israel was still counting the dead and the U.S. was determining how many Americans were killed or kidnapped, Eugene Puryear, a host at Breakthrough News, reported that there was, quote unquote, some sort of rave or desert party where they were having a great time until the resistance came in electrified hand gliders and killed at least 24 hipsters. 364 people were murdered and many more were raped, injured, and tortured at that music festival. At the same demonstration, the education director for the People's Forum said, approvingly after October 7th, yesterday the world woke up to incredible news. The actions we are witnessing are not simply free speech, they are part of a larger web of extremist activism with connections to terrorism and foreign governments. I encourage Congress to investigate these organizations, trace their funding sources, and hold them accountable for any and all illegal activities in which they are engaged. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Goldenberg. Now I call Mr. Walter for his 5 minutes.
Chairman Gosar, Vice Chairman Collins, Ranking Member Stansbury, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the honor of testifying. I'm president of the Capitol Research Center, where we study radical activists. I applaud your attention to the outrages perpetrated on Park Service land by groups who support violence in the Middle East and America. Free speech is precious. It's both the mark of a free country and also the means of our self-government. But speech is not violence, and violence is not speech, though radicals often make those claims. The extremists who rioted in July exalt violence, teach techniques of violence, and justify violence. They attack the very possibility of free government, which requires that citizens and government officials be able to speak and debate freely as they try to achieve their desired policies through rational argument, rather than by using violence to coerce those who disagree with them. But the radicals you're investigating despise free governments and democracies like America and Israel. They love tyrannies that rule by violence, like Mao's Communist China, the mullah's Iranian theocracy, and Lenin's Soviet Union. They follow Mao's diktat. Political power grows out of the barrel of a gun. Without violence, these extremists cannot achieve the dreams they graffitied onto Columbus Circle monuments. U.S. empire will burn. Israel will fall. They spray-painted, Hamas is coming, which means these radicals want Americans to suffer the bloody violence Hamas perpetrates on Israelis. As I testified to you in April, America faces a convergence of extremist groups. Take, for instance, radical environmentalists like Interior Secretary Holland's friends and family at Pueblo Action Alliance, a group that not only exalts violence, but joined in a riotous protest at the Interior Department that resulted in dozens of arrests and sent a policeman to the hospital. These environmental activists also support radical Palestinian activists who turn around and support other radical groups ostensibly dedicated to climate activism, anti-police activism, and more. In radical minds, all particular causes are part of a single cause, the revolt of the oppressed against the oppressor. As a 1960s American radical put it, the issue is never the issue, The issue is always the revolution. Similarly, the protesters this July chanted, "There is only one solution, intifada revolution." But to endorse intifada is to endorse violence. Israel's last intifada did not result in any effort to persuade others through rational speech and peaceful protest. It resulted in thousands of dead Palestinians and Israelis. Of the 250-plus endorsers of the July riot in D.C., my colleague Ryan Morrow identified 90 extremist groups that publicly support Hamas's terrorism or identify as Marxist, communist, or anarchist revolutionaries. These radicals work closely with foreign tyrannies opposed to America. For example, Morrow observed that Answer, the leader of July's riot, signed a declaration of the Committee of Anti-Imperialists in solidarity with Iran that backs Iran's direct attack on Israel and explicitly chooses the side of the Iran-led Axis of Resistance, consisting of the governments of Syria, Iran-backed Palestinian terrorist groups like Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah, the Yemen-based Houthis, and Iran-backed militias in Iraq who are trying to kill U.S. troops. One more bloodthirsty tyranny Answer supports is Putin's Russia, which Answer favors over the U.S. and NATO. I do not say that every critic of American or Israeli policy has succumbed to this nihilistic lust for violence and tyranny. And I emphatically do say that peaceful protests and vigorous debate over foreign policy are entirely legitimate in our free country. But this committee and the National Park Service that has the responsibility of overseeing protests in the nation's capital should continue investigating what went badly wrong in July and determine how to prevent similar misdeeds in the future. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman. I'm now going to go to the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Westerman, for his first 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Chairman Gosar, and thank you to the witnesses for being with us today. Mr. Spencer, I'm concerned there's a disconnect. You know, as an outside observer, it doesn't appear to me that the department officials are communicating effectively with the officers on the ground and the ones that are putting their life on the line every day. And I just want to get your input. How well does leadership in the Park Service coordinate with officers and take your input on issues such as safety and security threats, and particularly as it relates to events like what happened on July 24th?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chairman. I mean, to say it as in the best terms that I can is we work under the National Park Service, and these are bureaucrats that have never worked law enforcement with the United States Park Police ever. Since we're directly under them, there's a huge disconnect between what we do as a law enforcement agency in urban areas. The vast majority of visitor and resource protection for the National Park Service is with your huge parks and everything that are out west. They're patrolled by law enforcement rangers, and a lot of people get us confused with them. We are an urban law enforcement agency under the National Park Service that works in Washington, New York, and San Francisco. We're one of the most public-facing law enforcement agencies in the federal government for uniformed police. And with that said, nobody in the National Park Service has any experience with what we do, in my opinion. I actually believe we should be our own bureau under the Department of Interior, and I think that might help things a little more. I also believe our chief of police should have been here today and not somebody from the National Park Service who has never worn our uniform or been involved with some type of civil unrest, especially in Washington, D.C.
And when Park Service police run into issues like you experienced on July 24th and you ask for additional reinforcements, what kind of process do you have to go through, and how did that process work on July 24th?
Well, yes, sir. That would be, our executive command staff that does that with the National Park Service and the Department of Interior if they want to request additional resources. From what I know, if that would have happened, it would have fell on our budget, and our budget is already, as slim as it can be. We can't even afford to have. We can barely afford to hire 24 people a year right now per fiscal year.
And that's even though there was $500 million set aside in the so-called Inflation Reduction Act.
Correct, sir. And I don't know where that money went. It certainly didn't make it down to the United States Park Police, from what I understand, to the best of my knowledge. But I do know our budget right now, my chief, she's frustrated as well with how much money we have to operate with the current staffing levels that we have. If we would have asked for additional resources, it would have fell on our budget, and that's including lodging, travel, and then, of course, the salaries and the overtime of the people that are coming out here to help us out.
Yeah, I've got more questions. I'm going to move on to Mr. Goldenberg. Are you aware of any direct or indirect involvement by Mr. Singham in the events of July 24th?
So Mr. Singham is, based on reporting from the New York Times, the Daily Beast, our own independent reporting, is a major funder behind the People's Forum, which is the convener behind the Shut It Down for Palestine movement. I think it just so happened that Brian Becker of the Answer Coalition was, listed as person in charge. It was really an event hosted broadly by the Shut It Down for Palestine movement that is supported by the People's Forum, that is supported by Mr. Singham in Shanghai.
And as you mentioned, it's been widely reported that Mr. Singham is an advocate for the Chinese Communist Party within the U.S. Can you explain his longstanding connections to the CCP?
Yeah, absolutely. As stated in my testimony and letters sent by members of the House Ways and Means Committee to the IRS, Mr. Singham operates out of Shanghai and shares an office space with a group called Maku Media, a Chinese media company that openly shares its stated goal to quote-unquote tell China's story well, a phrase commonly associated with foreign propaganda.
So how does China stand to benefit from these disruptive and divisive protests that are associated with Mr. Singham?
It is my belief that Mr. Singham, potentially at the behest of the CCP, we know he has longstanding relationships with the CCP, seek to leverage the People's Forum and other nonprofits funded by Singham.
I'm running out of time.
Oh, I'm sorry, sir.
Get one more question in. If the CCP is not bad enough, do we know if he has any direct or indirect ties to the terrorist organization Hamas?
I don't know, but I know the organizations he funds are very supportive of Hamas ideologically.
I yield back.
I think the gentleman from Arkansas, the gentleman from New Mexico, the ranking member, Ms. Stansberry, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I really appreciate the tenor at the end of the last panel of really seeking solutions and to better understand the structural constraints that are on park police, how as policy matters we review applications, how our park police and the federal government decide how to do permitting, et cetera. So to that end, Mr. Spencer, I really appreciate you being here. Thank you for your service. Thank you for representing our law enforcement officers. I want to pull on the thread a little bit more that you've been talking about resources, and also you mentioned that several dozen members of the force have left over the last several years. Talk to us a little bit more about that. How is budgetary constraints affecting the Parks Police Force, and why do you believe that members of the law enforcement community that you work with are leaving?
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman. Basically, right now, to quickly answer it, in DC alone, we're supposed to have 432 park police officers sworn. Right now, we have 334. So just DC alone, we're roughly 100 officers below staffing, which is huge. And because of that, there's a vicious cycle of continuously canceling days off. And to put it into perspective, in 2016, we had 30 days, our officers' days off canceled for special events and First Amendment activities. Fast forward to today, 2024, we had 72 so far this year, and maybe even more since I looked at that number. So that's one of the reasons. And with the low staffing, we are consistently always having to work upwards of 18-hour shifts just to do our jobs. And people get stressed out, burned out, and they say, I could go to another federal law enforcement agency for better pay and not have to be so forward-facing with the public and have to deal with these contentious civil unrest and some of the jobs that we have. That's basically the meat and the potatoes of why people walk out the door. Other law enforcement agencies have, we're behind the 8 ball when it comes to our pay scale. Our pay scale, it takes 30 years to max out. Other law enforcement agencies are looking at 20, 22 years. We have a lot of veterans that have work for the United States Park Police that will, including myself, I'll never reach our max pay because I'll age out before we're able to do that for our retirement. So those are some of the reasons why people are walking out the door right now.
Is it your sense that your colleagues that you work with enjoy the job, and notwithstanding having to work long overtime and these pay issues, that they would like to stay with the force, but it's just folks are getting burned out, they're not getting paid enough, and this is a tough gig here in DC? Is that your sense of it?
Yes, ma'am. I mean, the job itself is great. And when I came on this job, at one point, we're upwards of 650 officers strong. And that lessened the workload, that made it more enjoyable. Days off weren't canceled nearly as much. I mean, what we were able to do in the past is you take a simple special event that occurs downtown in DC. We had extra patrols on the street that could supplement some of the activities that we would have to do to stand up a detail for a special event. So they would pull from we have 5 stations in the DC area, so they would pull the extra officers down and have them work that event on their straight time during their regular shift. The way it is now is almost every event that we have in Washington, DC, your days off are canceled for that, and that's because we can't staff it with our regularly assigned patrols anymore. We don't have enough people to do so.
Got it. Well, this sounds like something that actually we can work on here in Congress. I know that law enforcement at all levels of government, federal, tribal, state, local, are struggling to catch up and modernize their pay scales. I know in the state of New Mexico, we had to adjust both retirement and pay scales for both law enforcement and first responders in our fire departments. And so I would propose to my colleagues across the aisle, this is potentially a bipartisan issue that we can work on in the federal budget, and something that would have a demonstrable impact on Park Service's ability to serve. So with that, I yield back.
I think the gentlelady for comments. It sounds great. I now recognize the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Stauber.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Spencer, I want to begin by thanking you personally for your service, along with the dedicated men and women of the United States Park Police. Like you, I am proud to have worn the uniform, so I recognize the sacrifices that not only you and the men and women you represent, but also all of your families make. They make that commitment each and every day. And as Ranking Member Stansberry said, you want to lower morale in a department, you force overtime. You take their vacations away that they've been planning for 4 months. I can't imagine working 19 hours a day with limited rest and being forced to come back in. To be honest, it was very clear this past July that you did not receive the respect that you deserved, and this isn't right. In your written testimony, you discussed the challenges the U.S. Park Police faced on July 24th, due in no small part because of the lack of resources, namely personnel. As the U.S. Park Police is called on to respond to countless planned and special events within D.C. each year, this can't be an outlier. Mr. Spencer, how often does the Park Police face these resource and staffing shortages for planned events?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. As far as planned events, special events?
Yeah.
It's a lot. I mean, we have, I don't have the number with me right now, but we are constantly inundated. If you look at our weekly bulletin, the agency puts out information on which days off will be canceled, and they try to give us a heads up for the big ones that we know that's going to happen every year. But every so often, a permit will just come right through, and I get a call from somebody in the executive command staff saying, I'm sorry, but just let your officers know, we're going to be putting out information that your days off are canceled in the next few days or so.
Would you say that upwards of 90% of the events that are planned or come through that need a permit, that you have to either cancel someone's overtime or their vacation so you can properly staff them? Would that be correct?
I don't have that number in front of me, but that's reasonable to say so, yes.
How often does the Park Police request additional units from other stations outside of Washington, D.C., or from other jurisdictions completely?
For the big events that we have planned yearly, like the 4th of July, and then every 4 years, the inauguration is another big one that we work. Those ones typically we ask for outside resources, and that comes out of a separate budget from the United States Park Police itself. That's funded from another law enforcement budget.
Speaking of budgets, $500 million was dedicated out of the IRA for hiring in the park police. We noted from earlier testimony that only 19 million went for hiring. Where do you think the other 481 million went?
I have no idea. And I did hear Mr. Coulier say that it was 29 million. I don't have that information, but the people I've talked to in my leadership, I've been told 19 million, so there
Yeah,
might be.
in fact, Mr. Coulier he erred. There was a government report that I actually entered into the record that said it was 19 million. So when you have a planned event, how often are these requests fulfilled by your staff? Let's say you have a planned event and you need 35, well, let's say 40 additional staff for that event. How often do you get those 40 officers voluntarily without forcing them overtime and without taking their time off? Did that make sense? Does the question make sense?
Yes, so almost never.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, if there's an event in DC, for the most part, unless it's something small enough where our special forces branch where, we have SWAT and K-9, if they're not doing a mission or working the street, and if they're available, they'll try and supplement that first if it's downtown. But no, if there's an event in DC, most likely your days off, somebody's days off are going to be canceled. And that's
Again,
overtime.
I've been forced. I spent 23 years in uniform. I was only forced once to come in, and that was at Y2K. Everybody, I think, around the nation. That was it. You start forcing these men and women to forego their family vacations or their days off, or forcing them to overtime, you're going to have a morale problem. You're seeing this. It's sad that we put the law enforcement men and women in this position. I think that as the chairman understands, there needs to be a discussion about this. You have to properly staff, otherwise you're going to burn the men and women out. And when you start burning them out, they make mistakes, unintentional. And your quality, the quality of life we can raise your quality of life. We must raise your pay to make it equal with other law enforcement, federal law enforcement officers. And I'm very concerned what your comments are about the morale. I want to assure you, I will do everything I can to make sure the men and women who serve on our National Park Police are given the resources that they need to successfully deal with any situation they're given. I don't want next year you coming in front of this committee and saying so many were forced overtime, so many had to take their vacations off. You talk about a family destroyer, right? Thank you for your service. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Thanks for going down that line. Mr. Spencer, I'm going to ask you some questions. Hopefully you can answer these. Do you feel that your leadership gives you enough advancement notice or advanced training for these events?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chairman. Our leadership does. They do as best they can, and I see their frustration too. I mean, let's be clear. The chief, our special events unit, when they get these permits coming in, they don't want to call me and say, hey, I'm taking your guys' and your girls' days off again. Like, they don't want to have to say that, but it happens a lot. And the fact is if National Park Service approves a permit, comes our way, and there's law enforcement need, we have to stand up a detail for it. So,
are you ever consulted in advance about, a group coming in as to whether they're violent or anything like that?
We have an intel office, the counterintelligence, counterterrorism, that when we have roll call that day, I can say that they will brief us if there's going to be any potential for violence with the incident.
But you're not given any advance as to a group, let's say, that have a history of violence. I'm going to go back to qualify that. You know, we have college campuses across the country that says this is your free speech zone. They can restrict it even just to a zone. So why would you have to actually okay a permit for a certain area if you go to some other area that might be more applicable, where it's more defensible? Why couldn't you do something like that?
Are you talking about stand up a detail for a specific area?
Yep, absolutely. Just say, listen, you know, we're not going to apply this for your permit for this area because we want to make sure that it's got the resources you need, and we're going to direct you over here. Why couldn't you do that, or can you?
So I represent the rank and file officers. We have no say in the permit process whatsoever. And I know our leadership in the United States Park Police, the chief and the executive command staff, our special events unit, they're at the table sometimes, but they also have a limited role in the permit process. They basically tell them what we can and can't do as far as our security posture goes. And then the National Park Service is the sole entity that takes care of the permitting.
So that seems to me like that would be an area of collaboration we could actually do. You know, consultation, it seems like, you know, some people want to do free speech, but you know what, the timing may not be right. Maybe you can give a different zone that they go to. It seems like we have to have more consultation with those officers on the ground. Would you say that?
It would definitely be helpful if it could be, you know, if we could have a seat at the table. I know the union, we're not allowed at these meetings sometimes just because I might say something that they don't like. But I can't say, you know, I think the U.S. Park Police should have more of a role in the permit process, or at least be able to express their concerns more than what we do.
And transparency of allocated resources like money should be something on the table, should it not, for everybody to see where money goes?
As far as
where the money goes?
The money from?
Well, that Congress allocates to your, you know, to the Park Service, don't you think?
I would absolutely love to see that myself, sir.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. And thank you very much for your service. Mr. Goldenberg, you know, we talk about, I talked about earlier, I think you were in the audience, when I talked about disclosure on NGOs. For example, if they took 1 penny from the federal government directly or indirectly through a pass-through, they would be required by law to actually show us where they got that money. Transparency would be very good with that aspect, would it not?
Yeah, absolutely. And if it wasn't for independent reporting into the People's Forum and the Singham Network, no one would have known where that money came from because it was being passed through a philanthropic fund connected to a major bank that hid his identity. So there definitely needs to be more transparency into funding into the nonprofit system.
Would you agree with that, Mr. Walter?
With foreign funding, there definitely should be significantly more disclosure. I mean, on the one hand, American citizens have a serious right to privacy with their funding, but foreign nationals absolutely do not.
Well, you know, I think if you're taking federal dollars, I think you have to have that transparency, don't you not, Mr. Walter?
Well,
regardless
yes,
if you're a citizen or non-citizen. I know there's limits on that aspect, but you know, if it's taxable income, if it's given by the federal government, you have reporting requirements.
Yeah, no. Well, you're quite right. And when one group is giving to another group, that's not private citizens and should be disclosed. And Capital Research Center, where I work, has put out extensive suggestions for improving the IRS filings for fiscal sponsorships, for foreign funding, and such things, and communicated with your colleagues at the Ways and Means Committee about this, who I think are taking an interest.
Now, I guess one more question for the two of you. Let's say that you had something that was business related, something that would be applied to our defense of this country, like say the grid, like an electrical company or a solar company that has access to the grid. Would you agree, or could you give me some offers of that why it would be inadequate to ask for that a United States citizen or those who hold a green card from the United States are required to sit on any operating board or over any oversight board of that industry? Make sense?
Yes, that falls outside of my area of expertise, but maybe
Yeah,
Mr.
it's
Walter.
a little beyond my area of expertise, although it certainly sounds reasonable on the face of it.
Yeah, I guess what I'm getting to is if you have a bad actor, then if they have a green card or they're a citizen of the United States, you got treason aspects that you can hold them off. So you don't have that with others. So with that being said, I think we're done with our questions. I thank all the witnesses for your participation. There may be some more people that have some questions from the committee, and we ask you that you will respond to those in writing. Under Rule 3, members of the committee may submit their questions to the subcommittee clerk by 5 p.m. on Friday, December 13th. The hearing record will be held open for 10 business days for these responses. With that, the subcommittee is adjourned. Thank you.